Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our viewers from around the world. We have 1,000 people registered for this presentation, a reflection of the importance of the topic and the stature of our speaker today. Jonathan Tobin is editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate at jns.org, a senior contributor for the Federalist, and a columnist for Newsweek. He covers the American political scene, foreign policy, the U.S. Israel relationship, Middle East diplomacy, the Jewish world, and the arts. He hosts the JNS Think Twice podcast, which is available on all major audio platforms and on YouTube. I think it is an essential source of analysis and commentary. Previously, he was executive editor, then senior online editor and chief political blogger for Commentary magazine. He's won more than 60 awards for commentary, art criticism, and other writing, and he studied history at Columbia University. About a month ago, Jonathan published an essay on the confrontation between President Trump and President Zelenskyy, and whether that confrontation had implications for the U.S. relationship with Israel. We'll put a link to that essay up in the chat for those of you who want to read it later. Today, a month later, the topic could not be more timely. A poll published last week in the Jerusalem Post, taken by the Jewish People Policy Institute, found that 63% of American Jews were, quote, more concerned, unquote, about U.S. policy toward Israel in light of the recent developments regarding Ukraine. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is in Washington today to discuss three essential topics, and probably more, with President Trump: tariffs, Gaza, and Iran. I'm sure we'll get to those topics too during this discussion. So thank you, Jonathan, for joining us today, and let me turn it over to you to give us your thoughts about the Trump-Zelenskyy confrontation and its implications for Israel.
Well, thanks very much, Rick. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me to join you for the American Jewish University. Thanks to everyone who has logged in today to hear us. I think when in your introduction, you noted a poll of American Jews and their worries about Israel vis-a-vis Trump because of what happened with the confrontation between Trump and Zelenskyy. I think that says a lot more about American Jews and their feelings about Trump, and quite frankly, the way partisanship colors pretty much everything that we do in the United States, than it does about the U.S. Israel alliance. I think that's true for a couple of reasons. First, because, as I said, I think we live in the most partisan era, I think, in living memory in the United States. Obviously, partisanship is a big deal in Israel, too. Plays out very differently over a lot of different issues. But I think the great divide between red and blue America, in which, quite frankly, although I think, that would be sort of a webinar for a different day about whether American Jewish opinions are shifting, it's clear that the vast majority of American Jews are still Democrats. Most belong to the segment of, the demographic segment of the American population that is most likely to be Democratic, basically, the credentialed elites, the college educated, and they have very negative views about Trump. And so I think that colors pretty much everything that is said about him. Even when it comes to issues like Israel and anti-Semitism, on which, whether you love him or hate him, Trump has proved to be clearly, by any measure, by any reasonable standard, the most pro-Israel president in the history of the modern state, as well as the one who has done the most to combat anti-Semitism, especially on college campuses. So, but that doesn't mean that people who oppose him aren't willing to question pretty much everything that he does. Now, with respect to Ukraine, I think there has been a spirited debate, indeed, perhaps even edging towards a consensus among many people, from which I dissent to some extent, that would hold that the war in Ukraine is linked to the war that Israel is fighting against Hamas, Iran, the sponsor of Hamas, and the other terrorist proxies that have been waging war in Israel for many years, but especially since the October 7th attacks, in a sense, a multi-front war fomented by Iran. And superficially, there is a good case, there is a case to be made for that, namely that Russia and its ally China are linked to Iran, which looks to China to keep its economy afloat, and to Russia as at times a military ally, at least a source of some weapons. So I understand why people see Iran, China, and Russia as a new, axis of evil, to use the phrase that was used by President George W. Bush some 24 years ago. But while I think it makes the world simpler if you divide the world up into easily identified blocks, or even if we assume, as some very smart people do, including somebody I respect like the historian Neil Ferguson, who claims that we're now in a second Cold War with the main antagonist being China, and where Russia, and to a lesser extent Iran, are China's allies, that therefore everything concerning those countries is somehow linked. But I don't really think that's true with respect to the war in Ukraine and the war that Israel is fighting. I think simplifications about this are, can lead us to draw some very, simple conclusions, but really aren't correct. There's no question in terms of the war in Ukraine that Russia is the aggressor. Russia started the war, despite what anybody, including in the White House, might say. They're clearly the bad guys. They started it. Their position is unjustified. So it's understandable why people, sort of rallied around Ukraine. They were the victim. And they certainly earned the world's admiration for their ability to throw the Russians back and to prevent them from overrunning their country. And yet, that doesn't mean that that struggle hasn't been romanticized, and why that is. Now, I think the really fervent support for Ukraine in this country is linked to two things. On the one hand, many Democrats who frankly didn't blink, including the Obama administration, when Russia invaded the territory of Ukraine in 2014 and took vast amounts of territory, the Crimea, the eastern Donbass, areas which I will say, it doesn't mean that Putin was justified or, not in the wrong, but those are not, for the most part, Ukrainian-speaking areas. But, nobody in this country really said boo about that in 2014. It became an issue, quite frankly, for Democrats after Ukraine was linked to the first impeachment of Trump, and it became somehow bound up in anti-Trump sentiment, along with the fervent anti-Putin sentiment. Not that Putin doesn't deserve to be disliked and to be seen as an international bad guy, a rogue nation. But the myth that Putin installed Trump as president through Russia, through collusion with Russia, however you would have it, through the Russian collusion hoax, and it is justifiably called a hoax, has led, I think, a lot of Americans to see it, including on the left, who perhaps during the Cold War thought that we were too afraid of Russia, too paranoid about communism, now see Russia really as an evil empire, now that it is no longer an empire, even though they probably disagreed, if they were around then, with Ronald Reagan's estimation of it as an evil empire. On the other hand, many Republicans have rallied to Ukraine, I think more or less out of Cold War nostalgia. They haven't known really what to do with themselves and their views about foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And I think a lot of them are very eager to sort of go back to the old idea that Russia is the evil empire and that it is a mortal threat to everything we hold dear. Now, of course, Russia is, a bad player on the international stage, but it is not the threat that it was when it was a Soviet communist empire. I think a lot of the people who are very, alarmist about Russia and kind of want to have it both ways. On the one hand, they argue that Russia is weak enough so that if the United States keeps pouring, hundreds of billions in aid to Ukraine, which is quite frankly, Ukraine has gotten more aid from the United States in the last 3 years than Israel has gotten in the last 40, for all the fact that aid to Israel is always considered excessive and argued about. The Ukrainians have gotten, to say, by a factor of 10 or 20, the amount of aid. They think that, just a little more will allow Ukraine to defeat it, whatever that might mean. And I don't know too many people who are able to actually define what that might mean. How would Ukraine defeat a nuclear power that is much larger than it? And on the other hand, they say even though it's weak enough to be beaten by Ukraine, they say that if Ukraine doesn't beat it, it's strong enough to overrun Europe, basically to defeat NATO. You can't have it both ways. And quite frankly, it isn't weak enough to be beaten by Ukraine, and it certainly isn't strong enough to really take on NATO. I think both of those are myths. Myths that are sort of, reinforced by Putin's braggadocio, but not true. Ukraine, the other point is people want to believe that Ukraine can win, and they say, well, Israel should be allowed to win and Ukraine should be allowed to win. Well, these two wars are very different. Israel can defeat Hamas. Israel has largely defeated Hamas, but it needs to finish the job. It can certainly defeat Iran, and it has shown its ability. Iran can't do much damage to Israel unless it develops a nuclear weapon and deploys it. And, that certainly shouldn't be allowed to happen. But Israel is not in the same position as Ukraine. Ukraine is locked in what is, sadly, an unwinnable war against a much larger power. Russia has also proved that it can't defeat Ukraine or isn't likely to, so long as Ukraine has a minimum amount of arms. And after all, it turned back the Russians even before the United States poured in much aid. Truth is, Biden hadn't given Ukraine that much aid prior to the attack on February 2022. Trump had actually, for all the fact that he was accused of shorting Ukraine, he had given them more than Obama had. So I think these are misnomers. The war in Ukraine is now not about whether Ukraine will remain independent, but whether it will take back the territories it lost in 2014. And quite frankly, that's never going to happen. And I think the Trump administration knows that. It wants Ukraine. It may not be wise in a negotiation to admit that in advance, but that really is the situation. And that leads us to the questions, well, if Trump was so mean to Zelenskyy when he confronted it, when that confrontation in the Oval Office happened a month or so ago, and it was a very nasty confrontation, although again, as much as a lot of people accuse Trump of being terrible and Vice President J.D. Vance, they didn't like their behavior. The truth is, Zelenskyy made a terrible blunder by really questioning Trump in front of the cameras, just a matter of lèse-majesté. He just should have conducted whatever talks he had with him in private, not in public. And moreover, he has no choice. He's got to understand that the United States will only back Ukraine so far, and that that this administration is going to defend its interest. And it's not necessarily interested in an endless war in Ukraine. It wants it finished, and it should work to end this war. It won't be easy. Russia is obviously playing it tough, knowing that Ukraine is in a weaker position. But will that happen to Israel? Well, it already has happened to Israel under the previous administration, and and predecessors before. Israel has been bashed by the United States time and again. It's been bludgeoned by even administrations that were friendly or supposedly friendly, and it has survived. It understands that position. Will Trump do the same to Israel? Well, I can't make you any guarantees about what Trump will or won't do. I'm not inside his head. But if there is any American president who has earned at least a little trust with respect to Israel, it should be Trump. He as much as he does not think the Ukraine war is a matter of vital U.S. interest, he has demonstrated time and again that he believes that Israel's security is a vital U.S. interest. And he has done pretty much everything that America can do to buck up those interests, to support Israel, not merely in symbolic moves like moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, recognizing the Golan as part of Israeli sovereignty there, holding the Palestinian Authority accountable for its support of terrorists, but in terms of support in this war, when, in contrast to the Biden administration post October 7th, when the Biden administration talked out of both sides of its mouth throughout the next 14 months while Biden was still in power. On the one hand, saying that it agreed with Israel's goals, but then doing everything it could to hamstring Israel's efforts to finish Hamas at every point, bludgeoning it in the negotiations, pressuring it terribly. Trump has taken the other point of view. Trump has made it pretty clear he wants Hamas to go away, and that he's giving the green light to do whatever it can to achieve that goal, as much as both Netanyahu and Trump want to get the remaining hostages, out alive. So I don't really think the argument that Israel shouldn't trust Trump carries much water. Frankly, I think those who argue that are merely just saying so more because of partisan interest, more because they don't trust Trump on anything. And I understand that there are arguments to be made, pro and con, on every Trump stance, surely. But Trump has proved himself as a friend of Israel. Trump has proved himself as a foe of anti-Semitism in this country. And now we have many Jews on the left who are taking a position that I can only characterize as anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, opposing any efforts by Trump to really crack down on anti-Semitism on college campuses, which I don't think is in, positions that are very much in the interest of the Jewish community and the safety of Jewish students. So the idea that American Jews aren't trusting Trump has very little to do with Israel, even less to do with the Ukraine war, and everything to do with political machinations in this country, on which obviously Jewish Democrats are going to defend their partisan interests. But those are not the same as the interests of Israel or the battle against anti-Semitism.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I agree with much of what you've said there. Henry Kissinger used to say that wars are judged by how they end, not by how they started, not by how they're fought in the middle. Do you have a thought on how the Ukraine conflict should or will end, and whether Israel has any interest in a particular resolution of it or not?
Well, I'll answer the back end of your question first. Israel's interests in the Ukraine war had a lot to do with its own defense, which is to say that prior to the fall of the Assad regime, when Russia and Iran were pretty much as sovereigns in Syria, Russia was a neighbor, and a very powerful neighbor, with air forces with which it had worked out a modus vivendi, in which the Russians basically said, you can do anything you want, just don't attack us. With respect to it, Israel strikes on Hezbollah, strikes on Iranian targets in Syria and Lebanon. Israel was very wary of entangling itself in a war where its interests were not directly connected. Still, it was sympathetic to Ukraine, sent a lot of humanitarian aid, admitted many refugees from Ukraine, Jewish refugees from Ukraine. That wasn't good enough for Zelenskyy. Quite frankly, he did his best to pressure, really to bludgeon Israel, especially in the first months after the war started. I think he lost a lot of Israelis. He lost some Jews, and to some extent, he lost me when he made a virtual speech to the Knesset in 2022, when he said that Israel was obligated to do everything it could to aid Iran, including giving up some of its Iron Dome batteries, which Israel did not do because they were desperately needed and would, in fact, be desperately needed after October 7th. And he said that they were obligated to do so because Ukrainians had stood with the Jewish people during the Holocaust, and now Israelis should stand with Ukrainians. Well, of course, that was a blatant lie. Zelenskyy is Jewish, but that's a absolute lie. Ukrainians did not stand with the Jewish people during the Holocaust. Ukrainians were the most eager collaborators for reasons that are historically, understandable, just, not in terms of their anti-Semitism, but in terms of their hostility to the Soviets and initially being welcoming to the Nazis. But Ukrainians were active collaborators in the Holocaust as much of or more than any other people in Europe. So what Zelenskyy said then was really akin to Holocaust denial. Um, as far as how the Ukrainian war should end, will end, I think more or less everybody knows how the war is going to end. It's going to involve some sort of acceptance of the status quo in which Ukraine isn't going to get the Crimea back, Ukraine isn't going to get the Donbass back, where there are many Russian speakers, but its independence will be reaffirmed. It has proven that it can defend its independence, and I don't think the world will be the world will be willing to say, we won't let Russia attack it again. We'll come to your defense again. But, Russia can't conquer Ukraine. Russia isn't going to get Ukraine, but neither is Ukraine going to get the kind of guarantees it wants. It's not going to be admitted into NATO, which would turn the war with Russia into a war between the United States and Russia with the threat of World War III. That's not a reasonable request. If it was going to be done, it should have been done long ago. It cannot be done now. Now, just because we know that that's the eventual end, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. Ending wars, as you say, as Kissinger said, a lot harder than starting them. And this may linger on. We may get nothing more than a ceasefire, as happened in Korea. That war never ended. It's just an armistice, even though it ended for all intents and purposes in 1953. That may happen in Ukraine as well. We don't know. It would be in both countries' interest to end that war, but perhaps both Putin and to a certain extent, although he's been lionized as the next as a new Winston Churchill, which I don't think is true. But it's in his interest to keep the war going too, at least his political interests. Ukraine is not the Jeffersonian democracy that its defenders and those who have romanticized it would have it to be. But that's the way that war will end. Doesn't mean it will happen anytime soon. But I think the one thing that we do know is that Russia isn't going to be able to conquer Ukraine, and Ukraine cannot defeat, whatever defeat means in this context, Russia. And both sides will eventually have to admit that. The only hope is that more people, hundreds of thousands more people won't have to die, and the United States won't have to spend hundreds of billions more in order to keep that going.
I understand the argument that like politics, all wars are local. They have to be decided or fought or ended based upon their specific facts, the specific forces at play. But let me ask you about the counter argument that a lot of people have made, which is that there are at least three principles involved here that carry beyond the specifics of the Ukraine conflict. One is that you don't reward aggression. And the second is that big nations obviously should not be allowed to attack small nations. UN members should not be allowed to threaten other UN members. And there's a credibility of the U.S. deterrent involved here. If the U.S. is unable to resolve this conflict favorably after President Trump promised he could resolve it in 24 hours, there's a challenge to the U.S. deterrent as well. So, A, what do you think about those arguments? But B, assuming this ends in a stalemate where Russia achieves some, not all, but some of its objectives, how is that resolution viewed in Tehran and in China Does it have an impact not only upon Taiwan, but perhaps upon Israel, so that all small countries, especially Taiwan and Israel, have an interest in seeing this war continue until these principles are established?
Well, those are very fine principles, and in principle, I support all of them. But the United States has always ignored them when it had to. The United States didn't lift a finger when the Russians invaded Hungary in 1956. It didn't lift a finger when the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. Why? Because as much as it was in the principles of Western democracy, those very fine principles which we all like, not to allow a big country to overrun a small country, it was not in America's interest to get into a war with the Soviet Union over either Hungary or Czechoslovakia, no matter how terrible the plight of those peoples were, no matter how sympathetic they were. Um, we can't we can't save every country. We can't get involved in everything. I mean, we can, it is a grim fact of history. Going back to the Melian dialogues, in ancient Greece, when the Athenians told the Melians that, the strong do what they will and the weak must suffer as they must. That's terrible. And we must avert it when we can. But we can't always avert it. We can't, solve every problem. The American deterrence cannot apply to every conflict in the world. We learned that to our sorrow during the first Cold War, when we involved ourselves in Vietnam, and our deterrent, our worries that it would create a domino effect everywhere. Well, that led to, over 50,000 American dead and loss of how much treasure and how much more American credibility was lost by our involving ourselves in a war that we couldn't and didn't even really want to win in a way that would be decisive. Who owns the Eastern Donbass is of great interest to both the Ukrainians and the Russians. Who owns Ukraine? Who owns the Crimea may be of equal interest to them, but it is not a vital U.S. interest. Taiwan and Israel are very different conflicts. And merely keeping a war going on in Ukraine is not going to save Israel if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. It's not going to save Taiwan if China decides it wants to, blow the world up by crossing the Formosa Straits and attacking Taiwan. And quite frankly, if we are interested in defending Israel and Taiwan, and we, the United States, we do not have the resources we had 50, 60, 70 years ago that allows us to fight 2 or 3 wars at one time. Quite frankly, this is a fact of life, fact of 21st century life that I think the Biden administration didn't fully understand, but that the Trump administration does. If you want to worry about Israeli security, think about the fact that all of the arms that were pre-positioned in Israel for the United States to use if there was trouble in the Middle East were emptied out, were taken away from Israel, which could have used them, used the reserve ammunition stocks that were there after October 7th, and when it was involved in the war with Hamas and then with Hezbollah and Lebanon. They were all sent to Ukraine. Quite frankly, the U.S. armed forces have been stripped of all of their reserves of ammunition and arms to go to Ukraine. The United States is in no position to defend, forget Israel for a moment. It's in no position to defend Taiwan, assuming that the United States even can defend Taiwan if China wants to use all of its forces in its position, which is so close while we're so far. I don't think it can under the current circumstances because, we don't have that much. The United States Armed Forces isn't what it was at the time of the first Gulf War, let alone before that. So we have to pick and choose our fights. We may be involved, as I quoted before, wonderful historian Neil Ferguson, in a second Cold War with China. But the lessons of the first Cold War was that not every conflict is a proxy war, which we ought to involve ourselves. And this might be one such conflict in Ukraine. Not because, we want Ukraine to suffer or because, they don't have a right to national sovereignty, to choose their own fate. They do. And we ought to support that to the extent that we can. But that doesn't mean that it's a vital interest or that the fate of Ukraine is tied to that of Israel. Israel's position is very different. It is not involved in a war against a sovereign nuclear former superpower. It's involved in a war with Hamas, a terrorist group that can, if the United States, shows the green light, it can be eradicated. Iran is a paper tiger. Uh, it is not anything like Russia or China in terms of its ability to defend itself or to project its power. It's the world's leading state sponsor of terror, but it has been able to do so largely because both Obama and Biden did everything they could to appease it. So linking these two conflicts together is just frankly a mistake. And, I don't want, as J.D. Vance said, that, it's sort of moral hypocrisy. I forget exactly the term he used to try to say that the U.S. was being cynical. But quite frankly, it's just, these are to say that, no strong country should be allowed to get away with overwhelming a small country. Well, countries have done that all the time. The question is what is or isn't in the U.S. interests of the United States, what is or isn't in the interests of Israel. And whatever you might think about Ukraine, whether you're an ardent Ukraine patriot or don't care about them, their interests are not the same as that of the United States. And to pretend that they are is not a serious argument.
Well, and also wars, I think, look a little differently in the fourth year of a war from the first week, when I think everyone, including President Putin, thought it would last 4 days, not 4 years. And there is arguably an independent American interest, and perhaps an Israeli one as well, in seeing that Russia does not cement an alliance with Iran and China that are currently providing it weapons and other support to fight it. So that there is an interest, independently of the merits of the particular war, in ensuring that it does not continue to take up American attention, American arms, and the real threats can be focused on, which include, as you say, Iran, which brings me to Iran, because we're fortunate to have you today on a day when Netanyahu and Trump have been meeting for 3 hours, and supposedly or reportedly, Netanyahu has presented to President Trump what he thinks the parameters of a good deal would be if negotiations were to resume with Iran. So let me ask you your own views. What should Israel be doing with respect to Iran? Should we be attacking singly or in alliance? Should we be negotiating? Should there be a deadline? Give us your thoughts, please.
Well, I want to go back one brief point about Russia and China, which you alluded to in your remarks, your lead into this question, which is to say that it is obviously a goal of the Trump administration to break up the Russia-China alliance. He would like to, I think Trump would clearly like to do a sort of reverse Nixon and China thing, where where Kissinger, whom we spoke about earlier, pivoted, in order to break up Russia and China, and to undermine Russia, the Soviet Union at that time, in that way. That's clearly what the Trump wants to do, because this administration, I think, rightly understands that China is the global threat to the United States and to the West, not Russia. Russia is, kind of a gas station with some nuclear weapons. It is not the powerful nation that it once was. So I think that's a good goal. It is a goal, I might add, that every administration has tried in the last few. Remember, Hillary Clinton tried a reset with Russia, comically failing. Obama, did as well. He mocked Mitt Romney for saying that Russia was a geopolitical threat. Biden did too before the invasion of Ukraine. So, just because Trump wants it to happen doesn't mean it will happen. But this is something in which every administration has tried to do, and they ought to be trying to do it. As far as what Israel should want, to do to Iran, what it should want the Trump administration to do with Iran, clearly Israel wants Iran's nuclear program taken out by one means or another. It isn't likely that Iran will renounce its nuclear weapons. It has shown an unwillingness to do so over the last 20 years. It stood firm and it bluffed the Obama administration to agreeing to a dangerously weak nuclear deal, which more or less guaranteed that Iran would get a nuclear weapon. Trump tried to walk that back, but as soon as Biden got in, he doubled down on the appeasement. And quite frankly, now Iran is a threshold nuclear power already. Now, the one real disagreement so far between Trump and Netanyahu, between the United States and Israel in the last few months, has been what to do about Iran. Trump does not want to attack Iran. Trump does not want to get into any more Middle Eastern wars, both because he does not think that is a good use of American military power, which should be directed against China, not against secondary targets. He also just doesn't want to get into wars, and I think he reflects the sentiments of the majority of Americans about that. Israel's interests about Iran are obviously very much more immediate. It understands that Iran is a direct threat to Israel's security, if not its existence. And I'm sure that Netanyahu is making the case to Trump that if he is going to try to negotiate, as he's been making noises in the last couple of months, that he wants a deal with Iran, then he must get the deal that Obama might have gotten, 12 or 13 years ago, but didn't attempt to do, which is to say, demand the end of their nuclear program if they want sanctions lifted, if they want to rejoin the community of nations. Now, contrary to Obama's misnomer, Iran doesn't want to get right with the world, to use Obama's phrase. It's at war with the West. And I think Trump rightly understands that. But yet he still wishes to avoid open conflict wherever possible. That's a reasonable position, but it's not clear that that is one that can be sustained as far as Iran is concerned, because the Iranians have shown themselves relentlessly hostile to the West, eager not merely just to spread terrorism as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, but an enemy of the United States as well as of Israel. And I think they've already said to the Trump administration, we're not going to negotiate with you. They hope that Trump will be as easy to roll in negotiations as Biden and Obama were. I don't think that's going to be the case, although certainly some of Trump's envoys, like Steve Witkoff, don't sound very solid to me. But I think that's the point that Netanyahu is making to him, to Trump, in the White House today. I don't think Trump is going to agree to a joint attack, although that would certainly be the best way to get rid of the Iranian threat. He's going to hope to do so through economic measures and through threats and hope and perhaps negotiations. But sooner or later, the United States is going to have to make a choice about whether it's going to tolerate Iran being a threshold nuclear power or not. Israel certainly ought not to, does not want to tolerate that. In essence, it can't, because it can't have that sword hanging over its head. I think Trump may sooner or later come to that conclusion too. It's not likely to be today, though.
I want to give you a chance to talk about the tariffs, because the imposition of a 10%, possibly more tariff on Israel, pursuant to the formula that Trump has adopted, came as quite a shock, I think, to the Israelis. It's undoubtedly one of the issues that they've been spending some of the time today on. How does that affect your view of the relationship between Trump and Israel, and how do you see that playing out?
Well, the issue of the tariffs is one, obviously, that is, at the top of the American political agenda right now. Most economists, A lot of conservatives, think that what Trump is doing is nuts. I think there is an argument to be made that it is in America's national interest to kind of put some life back in its manufacturing base, that the globalist economics of the last 30 years have done real damage to the United States, to the working class. And this is really an issue which does, pit the haves versus the have-nots in this country, which illustrating how the two parties have basically switched sides, with the Democrats becoming the party of the credentialed elites in Wall Street, and Republicans now, although it is many sort of establishment Republicans are very loath to admit it and still are not on board. Republicans are more or less the party of the working class. How Israel enters into it is sort of interesting and, obviously disconcerting to Israelis. But I would like to sort of tamp down the alarm bells about it. Israel, a 10% tariff on Israel, it sounds terrible. And especially when you consider Israel and the United States are supposed to have a free trade agreement. And they were sort of like, wait a minute, I thought we were free trading here. Um, but the truth is, Israel is not, Vietnam. It's not China. It's not exporting. Its main interest in exports are basically in terms of information. It's not mass producing widgets to be sold overseas, or clothing. Israelis are not making the sort of the clothes and the gadgets and toys that Americans want cheaply. They're not manufacturing cheap flat screen TVs in Israel by paying below American scale wages. That's not the issue. I'm not really sure it's going to impact much of Israel's economy. Although obviously Israeli farmers are don't like the idea of having to open up their market. They want, Israel's dropping tariffs on imports affect certain sectors, which, sort of like basically agriculture, because they don't want, European goods coming in, let alone American goods coming in, undercutting Israeli industries. I think I would hope that this is something that Trump and Netanyahu can work out to their satisfaction, but I don't think we should be expecting Trump to back down on this issue as a matter of principle. Trump has changed his views on a lot of issues since he entered politics. Before he came down the escalator in Trump Tower into our lives in June 2015, he was pretty much a New York liberal on most issues. Whether it was abortion, didn't have that much of a record on Israel, and he's taken on a lot of the views of conservative Republicans, rather than them taking on his views. But there is one issue which is sort of, that he believes in, as we would say in Hebrew, be'emuna shalema, with perfect faith. It is in tariffs, it is in protectionism. That is at the core of his beliefs. He's been waiting to do this his whole political life. So anybody who thinks he's going to back down so quickly on this, even if it leads, sadly, even if it's really tanking Wall Street and freaking everybody out, he's not going to give it up so quickly, and he's certainly not going to give it up for Israel's sake, especially because Israel's stake in this is very, very small compared to that of other countries. Very big to Israelis, but very small in the big picture. It's sort of, if we're looking at the tariff issue from Israel's point of view, from its frame of reference, we're kind of looking in the telescope through the wrong end.
Well, I would say that Trump he needs to decide between two competing objectives of his tariffs. One, you can look at tariffs as raising a huge amount of money to be paid, at least in the first instance, by foreigners rather than by Americans, and therefore generating more investment in the United States, protecting our supply lines and manufacturing base. And therefore, from that standpoint, the tariffs are the instrument he has, as you say, been promoting since at least the 1980s. You can find videos of him promoting this idea. But the other competing objective of the tariffs ought to be to eliminate all of them, so that you have, in fact, free trade, which is a tremendous benefit to the American economy because it results in more jobs, more exports, more taxes paid on profits. So those are two almost 180-degree different objectives of these tariffs. And you could argue, I would argue, that Israel, by announcing it would reduce its tariffs on America to 0%, ought to be the cue for Trump going the second route and saying, okay, anybody who does, we will reduce this tariff proposal to 0% as well. And then what you'll get is the classical free trade that Republicans and most economists say is a benefit to the whole world, but certainly to the United States. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Rick. But I don't really think that that's what Trump or Vice President Vance are interested in. They're not interested in pure free trade as much as in principle, it is, economic sense. What they want is to strengthen America's manufacturing sector, not to create a free trade Milton Friedman utopia. They want to strengthen American manufacturing. We don't make enough stuff in the United States anymore. Certainly, we don't make the things that are essential to our national security. We basically the globalist economics, all the free trade agreements that were that were concluded in the last 30 years have basically eviscerated the working class in this country. That doesn't mean much to the credentialed elites. Doesn't mean much to a lot of people, but I think Trump rightly tapped into the resentment of many Americans. And frankly, that's why he's in the White House right now. So the problem, and I agree with that. I think, many conservatives who say that the goal should be let's have cheap goods, more cheap goods, and let's let people make money, and those are good things. But if you're a conservative, what is it that you're really trying to conserve? Because if you're not in favor of conserving American communities and the rights of American workers to have decent, productive lives, rather than to see their jobs sent overseas, I'm not sure that's really conservative. And I think that's where they are. Now, the problem with their point of view is that, again, I'll quote Neil Ferguson, it's not like Minecraft, the kids, computer game. You can't use your magic hammer and just, smash it down and create, investment for, to, revitalize American manufacturing and bring back all the jobs that we lost. Those jobs might well be lost forever. I don't think it's necessarily true, but to get where Trump and Vance want to go, it's going to take more than a year and a half. It's going to take a long time, and that will involve a certain degree of serious sacrifice on the part of Americans in terms of they won't be able to have as much cheap goods as they've had before since the onset of globalist economics in the 90s. And I think the people who, on Wall Street who've been making a lot of money off of this are not going to be making as much money. That's why, the sell-off on the market. So I think if you're waiting for them, after, if Europe backs down and, Israel offers zero tariffs, I'm not really sure that's where Trump wants to go. But we'll see. This is, as with everything, this is a story that we don't know the end, and we'll see where it goes.
This has been a tremendously insightful conversation, Jonathan. Thank you. We've already gone over a lot of time and we didn't even get to Gaza. So maybe we can have you back and
I'd be delighted.
talk about that issue. It's been a terrific session and we thank you. For all our viewers, please go to jns.org, sign up for Jonathan's podcast and read his very essential essays published 3 times a week. Thank you all for joining us and good afternoon.